Welcome to a Sandra Day O'Connor Civics for Life conversation series discussion with Rebecca and Pete Davis. I'm Liam Julian, Vice President for Programs and Policy at the O'Connor Institute. And Rebecca and Pete Davis are co-directors and co-producers of the documentary Join or Die, which has received many positive reviews, including in the New York Times, and which is available now on Netflix. Rebecca has produced for many different networks. For nearly a decade, she was a senior producer with NBC News. Pete is the author of Dedicated, The Case for Commitment in an Age of Infinite Scrolling, and he's co-founder of the Democracy Policy Network. Rebecca and Pete, thanks a lot for being here with us.
Thanks for having us on.
So
Excited to
grateful
chat.
to be here.
Yeah, great documentary. Why don't we start? Maybe you just give us the overview. Tell us what it's about and the highlights.
Yeah, so the title of the film is Join or Die, a film about why you should join a club and why the fate of America depends on it. So we, over the course of an hour and a half, try to prove out that argument of the importance of joining clubs and participating in civic and community life. And mostly, we're telling that story through the lens of social scientist Robert Putnam, who famously wrote a book that came out in 2000 titled Bowling Alone, that looked at some of these declining trends in, of course, bowling leagues, but also, things like the Rotary Club, unions, religious organizations. And my co-producer, who's also my brother, Pete, was actually a student of Robert Putnam. So we had a personal connection when we approached Bob about the possibility of this documentary.
Yeah.
And it's a documentary about Bob and his journey in discovering why joining a club is connected to the fate of America. It's about the history of American civic life, which is a really exciting history that we still think is very underreported, that behind all of American history, there's usually a club. And most importantly, it's a movie about you, the viewer, and the average American today, who is probably grappling with what do we do about all these public problems that we're facing today? And we're trying to nudge you in the direction that, this might look less like a silver bullet or one big brave moment where we solve all the public problems, and a lot more like showing up to Thursday night meetings in a routine way over the long haul. So that's what we hope to get across in the film.
Yeah. It was kind of funny. I was watching it, and I think it's your narration, Pete, at the beginning, where you say, this is a film about why you should join a club. And I kind of chuckled because it's like it's already like in the title, you like you join or die. But then I started to think, that title is, I mean, it references, right, a political cartoon,
Yep.
that famous one. I think some of our viewers might know, the segmented snake that Ben Franklin had done. But I'm just curious why you chose such a strong title. I mean, it really, I get the sense you're trying to convey the importance of this idea.
Yeah, and that line that you just referenced, this is a film about why you should join a club. That was our very first line of narration in the film, and that was, a conscious choice as we were, writing the script for this film to put the call to action at the front of the movie instead of at the end. I think a lot of documentaries, try to create an argument and then give you a call to action, toward the end of the film, write your senator, get out for this protest. We wanted to put that core takeaway right up front and then kind of spend, the next hour and a half journey with our audience, taking them on this ride through American civic history, and hopefully, leaving them at the end, understanding why that's so important.
And the reason we chose such a, we've gotten some pushback on our title. Some people are like, that sounds very negative, very intense, join or die. But the reason is, it had three important things we wanted to call attention to. One is this historic, it's a historic phrase in American civic history. It's written by one of America's great joiners, Ben Franklin, writing about how America will not survive. It was most popularized during the Revolutionary War. We're coming up on the 250th of that. about how if we don't come together, we're not going to survive as a country. We also wanted to say that today, less about the states coming together into one nation, but more about any of us as individuals coming together into a public life, a common life, a civic life, a life in clubs and associations and unions and congregations and all the ways we get together is very key to the survival of our country. And then third, it's very key to our personal survival. Your chances of dying in the next year are cut in half by joining one group. Social isolation is as big a risk factor as smoking. And yet everyone knows, the public health campaigns around smoking, but we need to start coming to an awareness of social isolation is as dangerous to us as well. And so it's not only that it saves our civic life, it saves our own personal corporeal life as well.
Yeah. I think that came into, sharper relief as we were working on the film. We started the film in 2017, so 3 years before, the COVID pandemic hit. And I think no one kind of is coming out of those years of this crazy social experiment we all lived through of seeing, is it the same to see my friends just through, the Zoom platform versus in person? And we don't need data to tell us it was absolutely not the same. Which I think has been an exciting thing to be touring the film now, is I think even that much more than when we started this film in 2017. People are really ready and understand in a very real, deep way just how important our social connections are.
Yeah. It's interesting because you guys have been working on the film now for quite a few years. It's only gotten more relevant as the years have ticked by. I want to talk about all that, but let's take a step back and, if we could, let's talk about the work of Robert Putnam. I think some of our viewers are familiar with his work. One thing I did not know about his work, that you bring forward in the film, was that it all started in Italy. So maybe you can take us through the progression of his work and how that began.
Yeah, one of the things that gives Bob a lot of credibility in talking about the importance of community is that he didn't start with the desire to talk about the importance of community. He was a communal guy. He was part of clubs. We show that in the film, but he didn't come to this through like a communal ideal. He came to it as a social scientist. And it's all started with an amazing natural social science experiment that happened in Italy in the 70s, which was that Italy split from being a centralized government to a government that had a bunch of regions that each had their own regional government. And he said to himself, this is a perfect experiment to test what makes one region succeed and one region fail, because they're all starting at the same time. So he studies these regions for 20 years. He's able to organize them from most thriving region to least thriving region, polling citizens. Are they getting things done? Are people happy? Are they building institutions? Things like that. And then the most important question was, well, why are people so much happier and are things so much more thriving in Emilia-Romagna than in, Basilicata? And then what he finds is it's not necessarily the economics. It's not the level of education. It's not, urban versus rural. He tests all these different possible variables. And what he finds is the most significant variable is whether that place had bocce clubs or choral societies or soccer teams or local newspapers that people read or people knew their neighbors. It was the social connections, the associational life, the civic culture that was the most significant determinant of what made a region succeed. And that's what led him on the next few decades of his work, bringing that insight back to America, discovering that America has actually had a decline in social capital, which is what, the phrase he repopularized to describe these types of connections, and how that would have consequences for our thriving as well.
Yeah. Yeah. It's sort of interesting, right? So he does this work in Italy, I believe in the 70s. Is that right, when this was going on?
Yep.
Yeah,
And
20
then,
years. Yeah.
yeah.
To the 90s.
And then
Yep.
it's in the 1990s, correct, that he starts to kind of think about this in terms of the United States, which is interesting. And you make this point in your film. The 1990s were seen by a lot of people as a time of thriving in the United States. The economy was going well. There was generally peace in the world. People were feeling good. But Bob was curious about what was going on under the surface. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, and there was this real canary in the coal mine moment where his wife Rosemary actually tips him off that, they're starting to have trouble getting parents to join the PTA in their hometown where Bob lived in Lexington, Massachusetts at the time. And, that kind of set off alarm bells for Bob. Parents always join the PTA. What do you mean they're having a hard time getting people to volunteer? And because he was kind of coming at that point, with this deep level of research and understanding on, democratic functioning from this study in Italy, that kind of tipped him off that things might be a little off, maybe under the surface, though, not in places that were yet being kind of noticed and reported, because, we're like fish in water with our communities. It's kind of the small things all around us. Are we talking to our neighbors? Are we, you know, participating in the park cleanup? Are we having dinner parties? Are we having picnics? These things that, we can take for granted. And, Bob actually took it upon himself to start digging into that stuff. He initially publishes a paper that comes out in 1995. And that paper would kind of send him on the journey to deeper research that then would get published in Bowling Alone, the book, which came out in 2000. But another thing I think that drew Pete and I to this work, coming from the generation that we are, is I think a lot of people think these trends happened, when cell phones came on the scene. And what Bob shows is, these trends have been growing, for decades and decades, since the middle of the last century. This was not something that just started, when the iPhone kind of came on the scene.
And Bob would say, you look at the social capital and you can kind of see the future of civic thriving in the country. And what you would predict if a place was having declining social capital by the 90s, you'd say, well, we're in danger of things falling apart a couple decades from now. And one of the interesting things about this film coming out, 20 years after Bowling Alone, the book came out, 25 years after the original article came out, is we have now experienced much of that civic collapse. And people are now asking, oh my gosh, what happened? Is it something that happened last year? But what we can do by revisiting Bob is we can actually say, well, you could have predicted that this would come. And the people who were turned on to this in the 90s were, shouting from the rooftops, if we don't attend to this foundational social connection, social fabric, civic culture, we're going to start seeing the ripple effect in the decades to come. And now we're experiencing it.
Yeah.
And that gives us a hopeful challenge, which is if we can rebuild that foundational layer of our democracy, then we'll start seeing positive effects 20 years from now.
Yeah. It's interesting. One thing that you guys do really well in the film, I think, is you highlight how Bob is not is he's looking for the truth, meaning that when he thinks he's found answers, he really kicks the tires. And so
Mm-hmm.
this initial article comes out in 1995, I think you said, Rebecca,
Yeah.
right? And
Yep.
he gets a lot of acclaim for it right off the bat. It's People Magazine, and he visits the
Yeah.
White House, and he's
He
everywhere.
went
And so
viral before viral was cool.
yeah.
Yeah.
So the initial reaction is, whoa, this is interesting. Bowling Alone. People are bowling still, but they're not bowling in leagues. Wow. But then he starts to get some pushback. There starts to
Yeah.
be criticism of his thesis in that article. People start to say, no, you're looking at the wrong stuff. People are joining soccer leagues and everything else. So Bob has this moment where he's like, was I wrong? And
Yeah.
then he spends 5 years trying to figure it out. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, and to Bob's credit, he takes on ambitious questions that I think would, scare other folks away. That first book, that he publishes out of the Italy study is called "Making Democracy Work," and he asks, "What makes democracy work?" And then in Bowling Alone, he's taking on this question: Is American civic life in decline, and can I prove that out? But yeah, I mean, he really goes, beyond just our usual suspects here. So, he does look at kind of our large data sets initially, union membership at one time around 30%, so you're passing people on the street. 1 in 3 people would have been in a union. By the time Bowling Alone is coming out, that's, really taking a nosedive. Religious congregation, turn of the last century, that was up around, 80% of Americans participating in religious life. During the course of us working on the film, that drops below 50%. But then he goes beyond those usual suspects and starts asking, you're finding surveys that asked Americans, were you an officer or a committee member of any club or organization? How many dinner parties did you host, last year? These larger survey sets that are really, able to help him say, kind of without a doubt, across every measure, we are seeing massive declines.
And if you're wondering if it continued, there was an amazing poll, amazing in a bad way, poll in 2017 that asked Americans, are you a member of any organization? And 40% responded zero. That includes congregations, which is like the most popular form of an organization. Zero organizations, neighborhood groups, unions, congregations, clubs, associations, boards and commissions, any of that, zero. And then 66% belong to zero or only one. So another 25% belong to one. It would have been normal in 1960 for you to belong to like four. And
Right.
now 2/3 of Americans belong to none or only one. So the trend kept continuing on.
Yeah. In the 1970s, the average American, we're just going to bombard you with some data here, but in the 1970s, the average American attended 12 meetings a year, 12 club meetings a year. By the time I graduate from high school around, 2001, that's dropped by 2/3. So just, really straight line down to then, it's around 4 club meetings a year. And that was 25 years ago now. And unfortunately, we haven't seen those lines turn around just yet. But I think our hope with kind of bringing this work back into the conversation through the film is that we can kind of be part of cheering along Americans that are working right now, and that Pete and I are getting to meet every day, thankfully, because of this film, who are starting and reinvesting in our clubs and associational life across the country.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think like we were talking about, when he writes that article and then he gets the criticism, then he does all this work for 5 years, writes the book, and then I think people are like, oh, actually, yes, we agree. And I think at this point in time, that thesis is pretty much accepted to be true, that across all sorts of indicators, you're seeing these declines. We put out a research report not long ago and it was titled, When and Why Did America Stop Teaching Civics? And we sort of linked to decline in civic education in classrooms with a lot of these indicators that Bob studied, that you guys feature in your film, declines in trust in government and everything else. You guys don't spend a ton of time in your film talking about civic education as such in classrooms. I know that's not really what you're focused on. But did you think at all about the interplay there, how those different factors might be kind of coming together?
Totally. One of the things that we've learned from diving into the civic history and talking to so many civic, super joiners today is that there's a total interplay between these two, and that the clubs themselves were forms of civic education. So by being part of the Lions Club or the Masons or, the NAACP, you would learn about how our system of government would work. And they would promote, so that was like informal education by, not only when you learn about the formal government in these groups, you'd also learn about the informal aspects of democracy, how to run a meeting, how to give a speech. You'd work that civic muscle. There'd be things you'd need to get done, like, sponsor a park, and then you'd have to interact with the local government and start learning how things work. And it would contribute to a civic culture generally, where it would be very normal to see that as a major part of American life. We have a part of our life that is at home and, how to be a member of a family, things like that. We have a part of our life that's at work, goods and services and the economy. And it used to be very, very normal to see a clear third leg of the stool, they sometimes call it, which is our civic life, that was seen as co-equal. It's just as important. When those groups start going away, you not only lose out on those informal moments of civic education, you also lose out on a sense that the civic culture is a must-have instead of just like a nice-to-have or a subculture for certain people to be interested in.
Yeah.
We also see with the decline of these groups the professionalization of politics. So politics becomes much less of like a thing that everyone sees themselves as being part of, and instead something that is like a specific sector in the economy. Oh, I'm an engineer, I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer. Over there are the politicians.
Yeah.
You know, when you have a thriving civic culture, we're all citizens caring about politics in addition to and even through the work that we're doing at work. And I think that trickles down to what we're choosing to teach in schools.
Yeah.
Or it's making our schools having to do that much more work now, right? Because if people aren't learning this just organically as they're out and about living their life, the onus is falling that much harder onto, you know, our formal education systems inside the classroom. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating because I do think when people think about civic education today, they often are thinking about classroom education that is either declining in quality or quantity. But to
Yep.
your point, I mean, this civic education used to be much, much broader than the classroom. So there's almost, while we're seeing the clear decline in civic education in the classroom, there's this other underlying decline that we're not really seeing because it
Yeah.
was never really codified as such.
Yeah.
But and to your point, the skills that you would learn in those environments are quite different than the skills you learn at work, which tend to be more of a hierarchical structure. But I mean, we think today about the decline in civil discourse. Obviously, if you're in a club and you want to get things done, the civil discourse is super important, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah.
we see this as
I
oh, you go.
No, I was just gonna say, you know, I think just to close out that point, you know, it's learning by doing. You know, like a small personal anecdote. I used to live in New York City. I was really involved with our bike and walking advocacy group, Transportation Alternatives. I learned way more about how New York City government worked because of the door that was opened through my work, you know, doing bicycle advocacy, because I then had to interface with, well, how does Department of Transportation interface with this politician? What politicians are going to help us get more bike lanes built? Why aren't they getting built? Where is the money going? You know, and then, you know, working with how does the city policy around what our streets look like interface with the state level policy at the State House in Albany? You know, and I think for anything that people are passionate about, you know, if it's not biking, you know, it could be your public parks, or it could be, you know, the schools, or you know, zoning for housing. There is an entree for you to follow that passion, you know, as you look to navigate the interplay at the politics level.
And this is something we're trying to emphasize with the film, is that vote is not necessarily the most important four-letter word in a democracy. Join is also possibly as important or even more important to a democracy, because when we tell kids or tell anyone, you know, it's very important to vote. Like, that's been something that's been kind of going for the last 10 years, is this kind of emphasis, vote, vote, vote. We're trying to inculcate like the sanctity of voting in elections. But if it's disembedded from the broader ecology of public life, of common life, of civic life, all you have going for you for pushing you to vote is just this message of like, this one thing is the most important, and I've been told 100 times it's very important. When it's re-embedded in the ecology of civic life, you vote because you care, you're on the parks, you're in the Friends of the Park Club, and voting's really important because that you want to support the mayoral candidate that's going to support the club, the Parks Club. Or in your neighborhood association, you meet someone who's different than you, and you find out that a president is standing against that person who's different than you, and you have solidarity with them, and then you say, it's really important that I vote because I'm voting for my neighbor. Or you discover a part of yourself that you care about through this work in 365 days a year in civic life. And that makes you become more connected to something broader, that makes you care about who's in office. And so one of our goals is to re-embed all of these aspects of civic life. It's important to get along with other people because we got to get stuff done together. It's important to vote because who's in power affects all the projects we care about. It's important to volunteer because you've gone out and seen your city by joining, and therefore you see all the needs that need to be done and all the care that needs to be given, and therefore you're drawn to it. and the goal, hopefully, is through all these people joining, we slowly cultivate civic cultures again that kind of work together as a whole. And that's one of our goals with this film.
Yeah.
And I think just, real quick point to add onto that, I think it gives us a deeper spiritual level of, who we are in the world, and a way to participate beyond just checking a box, but in a deep way where we feel like we're participants in shaping the world around us. And as humans, we're all looking for those touch points of identity. And increasingly, our politics has become a spectator sport, that we watch on TV like it's ESPN highlights. And what participating in community and civic life, outside the ballot box lets us do is feel like we're participating in shaping the world that we want to see.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. One thing I want to point out too to our viewers, listeners, is that you guys didn't just interview Robert Putnam, Bob. I mean, you guys talked to some real important people. I mean, Hillary Clinton is featured, Senator Mike Lee from Utah, former Surgeon General. You got Pete Buttigieg to talk about community. So you really did a good job. In addition to lots of people around the country who are just sort of joining clubs or starting clubs and doing that sort of thing. So I wanted
Yep.
to mention that because I think people should know that this is, while it's one man's story and you guys really went out and found a lot of people to talk to. Let me ask you some harder questions.
Yep, we're ready. Hit
Are
us.
you guys ready? Okay. So you sort of touch on this in the film. I mean, you do touch on this. There's a sort of a tension, or there's like uncomfortable aspects around some of this research, right? And one of them is that it seems to suggest that our democracy was healthier in the 1950s. And a lot of people, I think, would say maybe for some people, this democracy was healthy in the 1950s, but for a lot of people, it didn't work so well. And then there's kind of the concomitant question from that, which is like, did this work well because we were more segregated in our communities, in our workspaces, and that sort of thing? Are we, what we're experiencing now, is that a sort of consequence of, I think, what most people would say is a positive thing, where we've become more integrated with viewpoints and race and all sorts of things, but has that caused a fracturing? And then there's the kind of tension that I think Bob wrestles with, where people accuse him of wanting to go back to the 1950s, which clearly he doesn't in all ways. But these are sort of like kind
Yeah.
of tricky issues. How did you guys sort of
Yeah,
encounter that when you were
we
making
felt
this?
this tension as ever since we started learning about Bob's work. Like, Bob has always been very clear in saying that the goal is not to go back to the 1950s. The data just shows that was a high social capital time, and we can have a high social capital time again without many of the injustices and problems of back then. But here, in the making of this film and in talking with Bob, and most importantly, in reading detailed accounts of the civic history at the time, what you discover is you can kind of have this light switch flip in how you think about the rights movements of the 60s that came after the 50s that led us to overcome many of those injustices, partially overcome many of those injustices in the 50s. The feminist movement, the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement, and the kind of mid-century labor movement as well. All of those movements arose because we had a high social capital time at mid-century. And that's why I say you have to look at the thick histories here. What were the entities that performed the civil rights movement? It was clubs. It was the Bricklayers Union giving the building to the Montgomery bus boycott heads. It was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference being made up of congregations where people built up trust with each other for the 20 years before they start doing the Montgomery bus boycott or the, Selma to Montgomery march, or, all these other, the March on Washington. It was clubs that bussed people to the March on Washington. It was women's consciousness raising circles that created second wave feminism. It was groups like ACT UP that, great documentary on this, How to Survive a Plague, that helped, protect and advance and, fight for the gay community in this country. And so if we have a low social capital time, we actually have a harder time mustering justice movements together. And partially the reason that we were able to overcome so many of those injustices of the 50s was because we had high civic life.
Yeah, and I think, as we look out at the landscape today, I think, an important distinction that we also try to bring up in the film is this difference between mobilizing versus organizing. So, mobilizing, can you put out a blast on Twitter and Facebook and get a bunch of people to show up to a march? Very important. But are you also working on the other side of that, the organizing work? Are you collecting everyone's email who attended that march and then getting them into a meeting the following week and the following week after that and the following weekend after that? And I think one of the things Pete and I tried to do, creatively and aesthetically with the film is we wanted to make a scrapbook of American history filled with a bunch of faces that nobody would recognize because they were the thousands of people sitting in meeting halls, that really were the ones that fueled the movements behind the faces, of the big people that we do recognize, behind the Rosa Parkses and, the Martin Luther Kings. Behind them are thousands and thousands of people across this country, whose faces are forgotten to history, but whose power building is what helped, push this country to be the best version of itself that it can be. And as we continue in that push forward, we're going to need to find ways to continue not just mobilizing, but really organizing to keep moving ahead.
Hmm. Yeah. There's a person in your film that you interview. I believe she's a labor organizer. She makes a sort of a controversial point where she says that actually um, our focus in America on individual excellence and individualism, and I guess you could extend it to the meritocracy in some way. She says that that's actually that was a deliberate decision by powerful interests to keep us from organizing. Now, you don't have to necessarily believe that that's true, that it was an intent. But what I think everybody agrees is that we have become a society where individual excellence and meritocracy and these sorts of things are championed. To what extent has that shift kind of affected the sort of organizing that we do, where if I've got a free hour, I'm going to study for my LSATs instead of, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm trying to better myself um, versus better my community. I mean, did you guys encounter that as
Yeah.
being a major?
Yeah, no, this is
Yeah.
really interesting. And, we're kind of a believer in the idea of like two ways of putting it. One is like statecraft is soulcraft. Another way of putting it is our ideals are nailed to the cross of our institutions, by which both of these quotes mean the way that what we believe is important is connected to the structures of society. If you're going to club meetings all the time, if you're part of a rich civic culture, you're going to cultivate communal values. You're going to raise up people that are really good at being in community with each other. As those structures decline, you're going to raise up individual values and raise up people who break from the herd and are able to beat each other in combat to be the richest person in the world or something, and you'll raise them up as the people who will be honorable, and vice versa. As those ideals get raised up, it makes you more excited to create dog eat dog structures or on the other hand, communal structures. But I will say this: I don't think there is as thick of a divide between individualism and communitarianism. And here's the reason: we become our individual selves through community. The way we discover who we are is through our connections with each other. The chances we have for heroism are only make sense within the context of a community. And so I actually think we're hurting our individualism when we have such a hyper individualist society. We ironically get a lot more conformity in a hyper individualist society as we're controlled by large forces far away than the eccentricities and particularities and local cultures that we get when we have thicker neighborhoods and unions and civic organizations and congregations. The world becomes much less bland in community, and we get a chance to become much more interesting. So I would question the divide.
Mm, yeah. And I think it's good framing that you guys use in your film to actually push back against the divide and that perceived divide, in the sense that okay, you can think about this in being good for your country, but you should think about this primarily, if you want, as being good for you. Being good for you. You will be better, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Um, so here's another kind of tough question. One of at the O'Connor Institute, one of our three pillars is civic engagement. Um, and it's funny, I'll go to civic conferences and you talk about civic engagement to with five different people, and they've got five different ideas of what that means.
Yeah.
And so today, and you brought this up, Rebecca, a lot of times, civic engagement can be like, are you involved on social media and posting about politics? And I mean,
Right.
I was in one conference where somebody had this, how many times a day do you post on Facebook about politics? And
Yep.
they had it sort of set up like the more you post, the more civically engaged you are. But I
Yeah.
think actually the data would say that it's probably the opposite. The more you post on Facebook, the less civically engaged you are. But it's
Yeah.
all about what civic engagement is. So is it enough to just join a club, or do you have to join it physically? How involved do you have to
Yep.
be? Where do these positive consequences, where do you see them coming from? Like, how do they accrue to people and communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you're bringing up this question of like shallowness versus depth. And I
Okay.
think
Yeah.
that's the question we all need to be, investigating in our lives in how we are, quote unquote, participating. Are we participating in a shallow way, liking and retweeting? Or are we participating in a way with depth, going down the hall of your apartment building and seeing if your neighbors want to join your tenants union to fight back against the rent hike, or submitting a petition to city hall? And two other things that your point brought up is, I love that you go to a conference and there's five different ideas about how to civically participate. I mean, I think that brings up, another favorite line of mine from the film, from the same labor organizer that you mentioned, Jane McAlevey, who says, democracy is a pain in the ass. I mean, that is, by living in a democracy, we are choosing to participate in a system where we're having to bring together all our disparate ideas and find, cohesion and a path forward through that. And figuring out how to participate together is hard work. And as far as like, is it, the same as when I'm participating online versus kind of in person and when I'm sharing stuff? One thing I would ask people to kind of investigate as they are sharing, posts online about politics, is it politics that's just about the conversation that's happening at the national level? Are you sharing things about, stuff that's happening down the street, where your neighbors have a real chance of getting involved kind of today in working on that out in the real world off of their phone? Or are they just participating in this information kind of ecosystem that's just batting around a bunch of, opinions and shallow sense of identity, instead of that depth that we want people pushing for, of real deep participation where people are getting out and working through these problems collectively?
Hmm. Yeah. So back to the idea of individualism. It's interesting that toward the end of your film, you talk about how Bob, he started a lot of his work for Bowling Alone. He kind of looks at the decline starting in the mid 20th century, 1950s. These indicators start to decline. When he starts to actually push the date back and starts to look at what happened since, say, 1900 or 1890 or whatever, he sees these indicators have ascended to 1950 and then began a decline. So a few questions here. Obviously, that time when the ascent started was like the Gilded Age. You guys point this out in the film, when we were also experiencing another time when there was major divides between haves and have-nots and whatnot. And so that the community kind of, those indicators ascend and then they decline. Why do they decline? Well, Bob says one of the big reasons was television. Big reason that people could stay at home. So this is a tough question. Given where we're at with social media,
Mhm.
and given where we're at now with AI, where I can have an AI girlfriend, you can have an AI
Yeah.
boyfriend, and I
Yeah.
mean,
In fact, Mark
like,
Zuckerberg wants us to.
I know. So this,
Yeah.
and that is, well, anyway, we won't get. My question is, can we get out of this?
Yeah.
Like, or are we really in a place, and like just trying to like be honest about this, where we don't need to go to a club. You can stay at home and have the simulacrum, if that's the word I want to use, of community. You can have your friends that you chat to online. You can have your, so, I mean, what do you guys think? I mean, it's tricky, right?
I think, in the amazing things happen all the time. And we feel like when people create clubs or participate in public life, it's like opening up another magical dimension of existence. And that is not coming from us hoping that people feel that way. That's coming from almost every time people create new spaces where people come together to have that happen, they're always delightfully surprised. They didn't know that their neighbor next door that they had, assumed they knew everything about, had all these surprises inside of them. They didn't know that they had the capacity to lead some, giant reform in their city, that they never thought of themselves as that. We had so many introverts that have come up to us and said, I was an introvert. I thought I'd never be part of a club. And then they join a club. And then, or they lead a club, and then they're like, oh my gosh, I'm the introvert leading the club. And it's the thing that I love. We've had so many people come up to us and say joining a club has saved their life. And I think what they're each seeing is that this gets into kind of fundamental, radical spiritual questions, which is that what we're all seeking is being recognized by another subject out there. And even though in our hyper modern society, you can consume everything you want, you can get all your needs met. You can get a burger over here. You can get an app to have someone drive you somewhere over here. You can do this, that, or the other. You can even have people listen to you. But in the end, I think what we deeply want is we want to be recognized by a fellow subject. And that's something a robot's never going to be able to do. And that there's something sacred that happens when we recognize someone and they recognize us back, when we see in our scene. In the end, nothing we say to you on a podcast, for anyone listening or watching this, is going to be able to convince you. It has to be embodied. And so I would just challenge any listener, go out and spend a night doing something new with other people, or spend a night chatting with Claude, and see what leaves you more fulfilled at the end of the day.
Yeah. And, this is one place coming out of, being on production in the film through COVID. Pete and I can throw around, a lot of data now after spending all this time with Bob's work and other researchers. But that is the one thing that we don't need data to prove it to people. All I can say to them is, your kid went to school on Zoom for, a year, half a year during COVID. Was that as good of an experience for them as going to school in person? And the answer is no. No one needs data to know that. Do you want to celebrate your upcoming birthday, Liam, on Zoom if you have a choice of Zoom, or have people over for a dinner party? It's just like, no. We feel that deeply. We don't need any numbers to tell it. And that was, this, if we had any question heading into 2020 of why don't we just fully optimize our lives and just do everything online and I never have to leave my house? I don't think anyone came out of that natural social experiment convinced that that was a viable alternative.
Yeah. Yeah, and at the end of the film, I think Bob he's talking to a seminar, and he says he's hopeful, and he's hopeful because of the young people around him, and I think there might be some truth to that too. That we might have sort of hit a low point. If this thing is kind of cyclical, we might have hit a low point and might be coming out of it a little. And this is just sort of anecdotal stuff, but I feel like Gen Z and Gen Alpha have kind of started to realize that, maybe more so than millennials like me or even Gen X, or
Yeah.
started to realize that they miss something in COVID. They miss something over Zoom. And I'm starting to see that more in that generation. And I know some of the work with like Jonathan Haidt has been
Yep.
doing
Yeah.
around this. He's actually starting to see like, okay, these indicators are ticking up a little in some ways. He looks obviously at things like depression and anxiety and things like this, and seeing
Yeah.
that that's kind of coming up. I mean, did you guys get any sense of that when you were talking to young people, or?
Yeah, I mean, and that's where Pete and I stood by this title of Join or Die, even though it rubbed some folks the wrong way. Suicide is up 30% in America since Bowling Alone came out in 2000. As you mentioned, the work that Jonathan Haidt has so, expertly pulled together and crafted, in his latest book, The Anxious Generation, that, I definitely encourage not just parents, but everyone to read. These are not ticking up a little. These are hockey stick graphs that shoot up the year that applications hit our cell phones, and it's not just in the U.S. It's an international phenomenon of how it's affecting our teens and kids, and that's how he's able to pretty definitively point to it's not something just culturally happening. The technology is a huge impact. Certainly for our kids, but for all of us. I mean, they're particularly sensitive because their brains are still forming in those years. But as far as throwing more data at everyone listening, as of last year, so this is since the film has come out, average American 10 hours a day we spend consuming media. 5 of that is still television media, even if it's on a phone. So 5 consuming television, another 5 hours on average American consuming, social media or podcasts like this. So, our biggest, push for people that are listening is, listen to this podcast, but then afterwards, maybe forego the next one and head out and try to have a conversation with some friends and not just, be, filling your days with, what are called kind of parasocial relationships,
Mm.
where again they're giving us that shallow sense of connection. They're becoming fans and followers of your work, and engaging in a one-way direction with some ideas, but we need to be pushing for that depth, that fills us up, that two-way
Mhm.
connection.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, and I don't think I mentioned this maybe on the podcast, but Pete was a student of
Yep.
Bob's. You back, you said we made about 15
15
years
years ago.
ago.
Yep. And
Yeah.
one of
So,
our goals with this film is, it was a life-changing time in the classroom. We all came in as young politicos thinking the most important thing happening in democracy was happening in Washington. And what Bob
mm,
said is, you should pay attention to the president of your local Rotary Club just as much as the president of the United States. And that what's
mm,
happening, the most important thing to our democracy is what's happening in your neighborhood, in your civic organizations, close by. And, that's our message to you. There's a world to discover out there right next to you, and go seize it.
yeah. Well, I have to say, and this is abnormal for me, but I became a little emotional watching your documentary. I thought it was just so well done, and also you tell a public policy story, but you also tell the story of a person too. And I thought that was so moving, and about how Bob, a Republican at the time, goes with his now wife, his then girlfriend, I guess, and is there at the inauguration when Kennedy says, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country.
Yeah.
And has a moment where, as a young man, where he says, I've got some talent, I want to try to do something for my country. And then full circle, whatever it was, 50 years later, he's at the White House and there's the picture of Kennedy, and it kind of all hit him, and he got kind of emotional himself when he was telling that story to you.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was a lofty ask that Kennedy was putting out into that world, into the world at that moment. And I think you know the problems, and especially the rate at which we are consuming now that we all carry around televisions in our pockets everywhere we go, the rate that we're consuming the problems in the world, it can be paralyzing. They feel really big. And it can feel like, well, what can I do? What can I do for my country? These problems are so big. What can I do for the world? Or there's so many, I don't even know where to start. And, I think the message Pete and I are trying to put out, in the film is where you can start is asking yourself, what am I doing alone right now that I could be doing together? And that's a much easier starting place. And, if you're dancing by yourself, can you dance with other people? If you're cooking alone, can you start a cooking club and share soup around, the neighborhood? If you're watching kids by yourself, start a co op so every parent gets a night off. Um, And, as we've, researched clubs through history, it's things like that that started with 5 people. The Girl Scouts was started with a woman that had, a couple dozen girls meeting up in one town. And, now there are thousands of members, around the country. So, you start small and you don't know what that can become.
Well, I have to say to everyone listening, you know, don't get out just yet. Stay at home for one night more. Watch Netflix so you can see this documentary, or maybe invite some friends
Well,
over. Maybe have
even
a
better, we
screening.
are on a community tour. So we actually, if
Okay.
you watch it on Netflix and like it, we would love for you to then bring together your religious community, your neighborhood association, your Rotary Club, and host a community screening. So we've done about 400 community screenings so far.
Oh,
So
cool.
anyone that likes the film and wants to help share this message and forward the work that they're doing, if you go to joinordiefilm.com, there's a host a screening button on our website. And we would love for you to watch it together. And if you do watch it at home, please just invite a couple friends over.
There you go. Good idea. All right. Well, again, the film is Join or Die. Rebecca and Pete, thanks so much. This has
Thank
been so much
you.
fun. Thanks for taking the time. Yeah.
Enjoy.
Thanks for having us on. Great
Thanks
to
so
chat.
much.
Join a club.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye.